Dinosaurs have long infatuated and haunted the minds of humanity, from their humble discovery in 1819 to the modern day, where they continue to scare crowds in blockbuster action movies. One thing that most people don't think of when they imagine dinosaurs is intellectual debate, fierce battles fought by writing scholarly descriptions of extinct fauna. However, this is exactly what happened between paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh in a period dubbed the Bone Wars. Their competition on who could find and describe more fossils, and their religious differences fueled a fiery debate on who could be the more influential paleontologist. Edward Drinker Cope was a bit of a jack of all trades when it came to the biological sciences, for he was a paleontologist, ichthyologist, zoologist, and herpetologist. He especially showed an interest in herpetology from a young age, and ended up describing the genus of rattlesnakes, Crotalus, which is still used to this day. Of course, paleontology became Cope's main love over time, and he ended up spending most of his time collecting and describing fossil remains from across North America. During his fossil explorations, Cope ended up meeting a man who would eventually rival him to his bitter demise. Othniel Charles Marsh was unlike Cope in the sense of specialization, for Marsh was completely devoted to paleontology. Also unlike Cope, who grew up on a poor Quaker's farm, Marsh grew up a bit more lavishly. His uncle, George Peabody, was a philanthropist and had no problem with financially backing his nephew to receive a good education, and a good education did he receive. Marsh studied geology at Yale and grew an interest in fossils while doing so. He became so much interested, in fact, that he became the first ever professor of paleontology in the entire United States. When Marsh and Cope first met in Berlin, Germany, they bonded intensely over their shared love of fossils, despite having very different upbringings. Their respect for each other grew so large that they ended up naming extinct animals after one another. Cope named Colestius marshi, a prehistoric amphibian, in honor of Marsh, and Marsh named Mosasaurus copinus, a species of giant marine lizard, in honor of Cope. This mutual respect would change for the worst very soon, though. The change in mood for one another started slowly, as they soon realized that they had very different personalities, and their aforementioned upbringings played a heavy role in their disagreements, which they had often. Marsh was a strong believer in Darwinian evolution by natural selection, so much so that he even convinced a younger Thomas Huxley to support this theory, and Huxley would eventually go on to describe the evolutionary relationship between birds and dinosaurs based on this. Cope, on the other hand, grew up in a Quaker family, and due to this, remained somewhat religious for his entire life. Because of this, Cope did not believe in Darwinian evolution through natural selection, and instead favored evolution through divine intervention. Due to this difference in belief systems, Cope and Marsh could never see eye to eye when it came to just about anything else, even if it wasn't related to evolution. The catalyst for their main feud, however, occurred when both Cope and Marsh went on a fossil expedition with one another to a quarry in New Jersey, where America's first dinosaur, Hadrosaurus folci, had been discovered. To their delight, the area was still filled with some valuable fossilized remains, and after returning from one of the trips, Marsh did something that would fuel decades of intense debate. He bribed the workers of the quarry to send all of the fossils found in the site to him and not Cope. When Cope found out about this, he was infuriated that Marsh would do such a thing, and their rivalry was, quite literally, set in stone. The first main battle of the Bone Wars occurred when Edward Drinker Cope published a description of a species of marine reptile, Elasmosaurus platurus. Unbeknownst to him, Cope had made an extreme blunder in a reconstruction of the animal and placed the skull at the end of its tail. Fellow paleontologist Joseph Leidy pointed out this error, but Marsh quickly seized the opportunity and said that he was the one who said this, and ridiculed Cope immensely for this careless mistake. This led to Cope actually getting in a fistfight at the American Philosophy Society, as he was supposed to give a lecture on Elasmosaurus. Eventually, Joseph Leidy joined this rivalry, but backed out almost as soon as he joined due to Cope and Marsh vigorously trashing each other's works in scientific literature concerning a prehistoric mammal, Uintatherium. Funnily enough, it was actually Leidy who won this battle, as the name that he came up with still holds true to this day. Eventually, Cope and Marsh took this rivalry to the field, with both scientists going out west in order to see who would be capable of describing more species of prehistoric animals. Marsh and his team of graduate students had left first, and after collecting as much fossil material as they could from an area called the Como Bluffs, they dynamited the entire quarry, saying that he'd rather the fossils be destroyed than to fall in the wrong hands. This led Cope to divert a train that was full of Marsh's findings to Philadelphia instead of New Haven, where they were meant to go. Enraged by this, Marsh heavily delayed Cope's next expedition by sprinkling unrelated fossil bones around the quarry, understandably confusing Cope. At one point, Marsh had even placed a spy into Cope's team of students to report anything that Cope had found so he could steal it for himself. Eventually, Cope was able to get back at Marsh for the early humiliation of the Elasmosaurus skull, for Marsh had, in a hurry to find a new dinosaur, placed a skull of Camarasaurus onto the skeleton of an Apatosaurus and called it a new dinosaur, Brontosaurus. Eventually, these battles of the Western Territories died down, as neither scientist could afford to go on any more expeditions. However, they still would continually bash each other in scientific literature and the press. They would often fight over things such as plagiarism, classification errors, fraud, and even the misspending of grant money. However, these years of fighting with one another had both taken a toll on the two scientists financially. Cope was no longer able to support himself and had to sell his only financial asset, his fossils. Many of these fossils ended up going back to Marsh. Marsh also ended up winning the Cuvier Award, the highest award in paleontology. This threw Cope in a downward spiral, and he eventually contracted an unknown illness, which he believed was a urinary tract infection. However, the true cause remains unknown. During this, he prescribed himself a multitude of drugs, including formalin, which is an ingredient of formaldehyde. Both of these factors led to Cope's death in 1897, and his last request was to have both his and Marsh's skulls measured to see whose brain was larger, which, at the time, was thought to have determined intelligence. Marsh denied having this done to himself, and Cope's skull still sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology to this day. In the end, the true winner of the Bone Wars was the scientific community, for without the bitter rivalry fueling these two brilliant paleontologists, many of the things we now know about prehistoric life or evolution may have never come to knowledge. In this sense, despite the reckless behavior of both Cope and Marsh when it came to fossils, this series of debates truly defined what paleontology, and all aspects of biology, is today.